Richard arrived in 1975 as the Cultural Revolution was ending and was pretty much gone by that time. What did you see in Hong Kong in 1975?
Let me back up just a second. Bill asked me to tell a story that would be mildly funny, he said. Mildly funny. I thought it was kind of low expectations on the humor. I'm a very serious person, and that funny is not my thing. But I'm feeling nostalgic. I'm very good at tear-jerking nostalgia. That's one of my strong suits. And Hong Kong, even now on those rare occasions when I go to Hong Kong, I feel that, kind of Proustian sadness because I was young then and I'm old now. And, everything was new and fresh and, there were, what I've done in life now, I've done, and, then I was going to do it. All those things. So, certainly there were no remnants or residues whatsoever of the Cultural Revolution or the kind of turmoil that we just heard about. Hong Kong was very, very stable under British rule, very orderly place, very low crime, growing all the time in prosperity. I remember early on, I had an interview with a guy, a Chinese businessman who had been to the Harvard Business School, and he had just conducted the first corporate hostile takeover of a large American or foreign company. I don't know. It was Bull of a Watch. And so this was a new story. I was working for Time Magazine then for the business section. I went and interviewed him. This is 1976 probably. And after I finished interviewing him, he asked me what I thought of the property market and whether the property market had really kind of reached its height or whether it was still okay to invest. And I said, "You're asking me? You're the guy who just took over Bull of a Watch. You're asking me about the Hong Kong property market." And I hope that he bought. And I'm sorry that I didn't.
I'm sorry about it too.
Yeah. I guess a lot of us are in 1975. But Hong Kong was my first foreign posting. I was still in my 20s. It was a thrilling city. I remember thrilling even before you got there because you remember we used to have to come, if you took the city side landing at Kai Tak Airport, you kind of, the wings almost seemed to brush up against the buildings as you came down. And then you would land and there would be the water and then the view of Hong Kong in the distance, which never stopped thrilling me to just be in this place. It kind of reeked of a kind of post-colonial exoticism. And I have to say that I enjoyed that kind of post-colonial. But I used to love to take the Star Ferry. It was the only mode of transportation on which I could afford to travel first class. So it was my reason. So I would buy my first class ticket on the Star Ferry and go back and forth and just always be astonished at that amazing view. And I had an amazing view from my apartment. I remember when I first got an apartment, I was on Bowen Road.
Bowen Go.
And I mastered Cantonese to the extent of being able to say Bowen Go to the taxi drivers. And I had a terrace and a beautiful view of the harbor. And I could stand on my terrace, with my coffee in the morning and look at the harbor and pinch myself and say, "My God, I'm being paid for this. This is just unbelievable." Of course, what we did in those days, I was there until 1979. And then we collectively, there was a kind of a group of us that had all known each other in school. We had been at Harvard in graduate school. We studied Chinese in graduate school. And the famous John K. Fairbank was our sort of chieftain. And I always thought of ourselves, me in particular, as one of Fairbank's failures. Because the failures, the ones that didn't get PhDs and go on to university careers, were the journalists. So Fox Butterfield was the first who went to work for the New York Times, which I went to work for later, and then I came along for Time Magazine. Jay and Linda Matthews were also in that group. So it was like this, and Dorinda Elliott was a little bit later, but she was there. And we all kind of knew each other from before, and then we all were in Hong Kong, and then a few years later we were all in Beijing. So it's almost like a kind of a generational feeling, a fraternity. The people that studied about China, studied Chinese, knew a little something, or at least we knew enough to know what we didn't know. And then speaking of which, I will finish. You know, our job was what we call China watching. Sometimes we were able to go to China, although I think I went for the first time. I was in China in 1972 with a student delegation. So I was there very, very early as a kind of, you know, moderately Maoist, you know, it was mildly Maoist.
Mildly amusing Mao.
Yeah, sort of anti-Vietnam War. But I can tell you a little serious note here that that trip to China made me a lifelong anti-communist. And I very, very quickly gave up any illusions I might have had about a kind of benign authoritarianism and benign dictatorship, and I still feel that way. But we used to watch China. We used to have meetings. There were these, I don't know when were you ever in Hong Kong or you were only in China? You were. We used to have these monthly meetings, diplomats, the China watchers at the consulates, there weren't embassies, consulates, and the journalists would take turns paying for a big roundtable discussion about China. We couldn't go there, it was very hard to go there. We read the survey of the China mainland press, remember that? And we would
FBIS, Foreign Broadcast.
FBIS, yeah, foreign
FBIS, we had them in Russia too.
Well, there was FBIS, and then there was also something called the SCMP, not the South China Morning Post, but the Survey of the China Mainland Press, which was translations of radio broadcasts. And we would sit there, I mean, talk about tedium. Nothing more boring than spending your day reading, you know, translations of Chinese broadcasts, especially in those days. Now there's interesting stuff that happens in China, but in those days it was all pretty much propaganda. But weirdly, even though we had such limited information, we sort of, I think, got the basic story right. The basic story that was being denied in Beijing, which was that there was a power struggle involving Zhou Enlai on the one side and the Gang of Four and Jiang Qing on the other, a contest between a more reformist group and a more hardline ideological group. And I think, you know, we wrote that, and I think we were right. So I think we can be proud that we didn't really get the story wrong. I don't think that we made mistakes, but I think that our portrayal of Chinese politics certainly was actually fairly accurate.
Great.
And so with that bit of self-congratulation.
Historian.